Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rose. Good morning, everyone. I'm Regina Gia. I'm president of the Garden State Initiative, and I'm here to welcome you along with our co-sponsors. This morning are the New Jersey Sheriff's Association. President Jim Gannon is here with me. Thank you very much for your partnership on this event, as well as the urban mayors of New Jersey. And I'd like to thank both Vice President Barbara George Johnson and Associate Director Ishia Hayes, helping to organize everything we're putting together today. We're hopefully going to form a terrific partnership among our organizations in building public policies going forward for not just Paterson, but across the state. So for the next 90 minutes, we're going to discuss a range of issues that need more attention and more investment in New Jersey. I know each mayor is going to raise issues to discuss with former Commissioner Bratton, and they'll be familiar to him and all of his experiences in the past that he's tackled. But at the same time, they'll be unique for this time in New Jersey and what we're facing in our state. So each of us who sits here in this room knows that there are many critical issues, including increasing wages, expanding home ownership, and strengthening our economy that start with personal safety. As each of us know, there's still significant work to be done. And in many policy areas, we stand united in prioritizing this issue of personal safety. Most of all, we can define sensible, common ground where we can come together and build public policy solutions that focus on understanding that gun violence and public safety go hand in hand with economic development. And as the president and founder of the Garden State Initiative, it's something we're deeply passionate about and addressing. And so with the New Jersey Urban Mayors Association, the Sheriff's Association, we're committed to providing city leaders like these mayors the tools and freedom to maximize each of their city's potential. It's the only way we're going to be of sustained economic growth. So I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone on today's panel and thankful to Commissioner Bratton for joining us for his unique perspective. Moderating this morning's and introducing Commissioner Bratton is Mr. Larry Mone, the founding board member of GSI, and served as president of the Manhattan Institute from 1995 until 2019. Under Larry's leadership, the Manhattan Institute sponsored and disseminated research on such topics as tax and economic policy, education, welfare reform, and crime. The Institute expanded its work with civic leaders in New York, including Commissioner Bratton, and across the country to promote free market solutions for urban policy challenges. Larry's a graduate of the College of Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, and earned a master's degree in public policy from the University of California at Berkeley. So thank you again all for coming. And Larry, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Regina. This is really a pleasure and an honor to introduce Bill Bratton, who is quite simply the most accomplished law enforcement officer in our nation's history, I think. Quite frankly, if you look over those 40 years, and I had the pleasure of watching him work over 30 of those years. He was the police commissioner in Boston. He was the police commissioner in New York twice, police commissioner in Los Angeles once, and would have been the head of Scotland Yard if they could have gotten the citizenship thing squared away.
That's true.
But
there's still time.
There's still time. But that's how highly considered he was, both internationally as well as nationally. I know that for a fact. So I thought the easiest way to condense the knowledge that Bill has accumulated over time is to really hone in on kind of three key episodes in his career, which illustrate so many of the points that he thinks are important even for today as we look at our current situation. So I'll start in 1990 when Richard Kiley, who was the head of the Metropolitan Transit Authority, and George Kelling, the famous scholar who did Fixing Broken Windows, convinced Bill to come to New York and head up the transit police, which oversaw the subways. It was a small subunit, not under the control of NYPD in general. And the situation in the subways was eerily similar to what the stories you're now seeing in the New York Post. So why don't you take us into that time, what you confronted and what you did about it?
Thank you, Larry. Before answering the question, a thank you to the mayors that are here, the sheriff certainly, and your organization for hosting today's collaboration. And that's effectively what it is, to listen to each other, to gain additional insights, what worked, what didn't work. And effective public safety is all about collaboration between the public, between elected leaders, and certainly between law enforcement officials. And the comment about Mayor Koch, that in terms of his favorite expression, how am I doing? That I've kind of adopted that myself as I've moved around the country. But another comment that, and I knew the mayor very well, had the opportunity in the last years of his life to spend some time with him. Another one, when he was defeated in his last effort to become the mayor third term, was after the election, when asked about it, he said, well, the people have spoken, now they must be punished. And in many respects they were. And I would argue that some of what's going on today in 2021 mirrors New York City of 1990. And my comments will be about New York specifically because it's the city I'm most intimately familiar with. But what's going on in New York right now is basically being replicated around the country, unfortunately. 1990, New York City, I am recruited to come from Boston, where I headed up a series of police departments, to head up that 3,800 police officer department. At the time, it was the 10th largest police department in the country. The NYPD had 25,000 officers, and the housing police, a separate police force, 3,400. So that New York had 3 separate police departments. You could not join the transit police. You signed up to join the NYPD, but on the day of your appointment, you were assigned to housing, transit, or NYPD. So effectively, you were drafted into the transit police. So a source of great frustration of many young men and women at that time were starting to come in. But New York City of 1990 was an awful place as it relates to public safety. The worst crime year in the history of that city, and the worst crime year in the history of our country. New York City, 2,243 murders, 5,000 people shot on the streets, 100,000 burglaries, 100,000 robberies, domestic violence. A woman was 6 times more likely to be assaulted in her home than on the streets of the subways. And that was the crime situation. But even worse was the day-to-day chaos on the streets. 7,000 open-air drug-selling locations on every street corner, every park. Bryant Park, the now celebrated Pine Park behind the library, is known as Needle Park, because at lunchtime every day, hundreds would converge on the park to buy their drugs. Times Square was a 3-ring circus, literally, with every conceivable illegal activity under the sun occurring there. And as bad as that was, the subways were worse. The subways, with their confined space, the idea you're going below ground, in some respects was like going into Dante's Inferno, the 9 levels of hell. Well, the subways were the lower levels of hell. I met David Gunn, the president, who was involved in the recruiting of me from Massachusetts to come to New York. George Kelling had been a close friend and advisor. I implemented a lot of his ideas around the importance of crime and disorder being attacked at the same time, and it had some great success in Boston based on that success. George and Bob Kiley, who had worked in Boston as a deputy mayor, felt, well, maybe this kid from Boston, and I was a kid basically in those days, might be able to do something. The carrot they held out in front of me was the idea subways, transit police might be like an off-Broadway production. Who knows, if you could succeed in the subway, maybe you might be able to make it to Broadway. And Broadway was one police plaza. Who knows, you might, the idea of a kid from Boston, New York City police commissioner. Well, that was the carrot that they dangled in front of me. And then basically I went for it. Came to New York and first exposure to the Manhattan Institute that Larry worked with, one of the country's great think tanks, research institutes. And over 30 years, I've spent many a time and occasions they've sponsored, written for them extensively, and implemented many of the great ideas that they've advanced over those 30 years. But the subway was the first grand experiment. And within 2 years, we had turned crime around dramatically in the subway system to a much greater extent than was occurring on the streets of New York, to the extent that the subways, which only had 22 murders out of those 1,943, most people thought 50% of them occurred in the subway. 250,000 fare evaders every day, 5,000 homeless living in the subway. Until recently, every subway car had been covered with graffiti. What a sign of public safety that was to the riding public about how secure they must feel, where the vandalism was rampant. And a very demoralized police force, where the police department's union was basically trying to merge with the NYPD. They were trying to merge themselves out of existence. Without going into a lot of detail, we turned it around. Turned it around to such an extent that Rudy Giuliani, who had lost his campaign against David Dinkins, was running again in 1993, asked Kelly and I to come down to see him and talk about how did you turn it around in the subways so quickly and the city is still struggling. 6,000 more cops that David Dinkins, the mayor, had successfully lobbied for in Albany. Imagine lobbying successfully for 6,000 cops and getting it. But the problem was that they didn't use them correctly, that they were not addressing the quality of life issues, the squeegee pests, the aggressive begging, the street prostitution, the drug dealing. They were trying to put into place a community policing program, but in some respects, you needed to basically take the streets and the subways back before you could implement community policing. And they were doing it backwards. They were trying to put community policing in before they had effectively made the streets and subways safe. So that's what we told Giuliani. And Giuliani said, well, can you make the streets as safe as the subways have been made? And I said, certainly. He gets elected in 1994. I have that by this time gone back to Boston, had become police commissioner in my initial department. And he recruited me to come in as his first police commissioner. And I think the rest is well-known history that I recounted in my book, The Profession. I recounted it in more detail in my first book, Turnaround. And in the 27 months I served with him, I had predicted for him that we would get crime down by 40% in 3 years. When I left after those 27 months, it was down 39%. And more importantly, I believe, because what people saw every day, was we turned around the quality of life, fixed the broken windows in the city, got rid of those 7,000 open-air drug locations, and we're going after the 8,000 indoor ones. We had gotten rid of the 100 squeegee pests. Imagine 38,000 cops, 100 squeegee pests. You know how long it took us to get rid of them? A day. The odds were in our favor, I think. Street prostitution, graffiti, we turned it all around. The one deficiency, however, was the improvement of relationships, particularly with our minority communities, community most impacted by the crime and disorder, both in terms of the victims as well as those that were basically raping, robbing, and stealing from them, that despite that dramatic crime decline, improvement in quality of life, crime went down in every one of New York City precincts by double digits, everyone. It wasn't just here or there. And it went down most dramatically, as you might expect, in those that had the most crime and disorder. But the race relation aspects did not improve. Some of that, I think, was reflective of Giuliani having lost the first black mayor and the tension between him and that mayor and tension with the black population. So even though I'm a strong believer and advocate, and maybe one of the strongest advocates for community policing, neighborhood policing, as part of this crime and disorder reduction, that we were not able to really engage fully from the mayor's office and the other agencies of government in dealing with those communities. Unfortunately, the mayor and I talk about this in my book, that one of the greatest mistakes in my life as a police commissioner was not working closely with my mayor. That all of you who are police chiefs out there need to understand that 3 guys here to my left, they control your destiny. In a battle between a police chief and a mayor, mayors usually win. And that was a lesson I learned, that while Giuliani and I will forever share the success of crime reduction in New York City and making it the safest large city in America, I was not smart enough to stay close enough to him. I didn't stay in his headlights. I not only didn't stay in his headlights, I went over the guardrail, the Jersey barrier, into the ditch, rolled the car over, and basically the only thing that saved me was the seatbelt. And so we smiled with each other. He gave me a key to the city and on my last day, and then we went off, but things were tense. And I thought my police career was over in 1996. But Larry, the ideas had taken hold, the idea that you could do something about crime, you could do something about disorder. And let me close with this comment, and it's referenced frequently in my book, The Profession, that Sir Robert Peel is my personal role model, if you will. There are two, and I'll reference a second one. But Sir Robert Peel created the Metropolitan Police in London, 1829, the first major police department in a democracy. Understanding their democracy is very different than ours. But that the obligation in a democracy of public safety being the priority was reflected in the creation of the Metropolitan Police. And he had 9 principles of policing, which it's my, God had 10 commandments, Peel had 9, and I have 9. The first one was the basic mission for which the police exist is, and these are the 5 most important words in democratic policing, to prevent crime and disorder. Prevent crime and disorder. You can't just go after crime without going after disorder. You're going to fail. And that's what happened in the 70s and 80s. You paid no attention to disorder. You can't just go after disorder without going after crime at the same time. It just does not work. So he understood that in 1829. But what he also understood was prevent. That is the mission. We can't take satisfaction because we make 1,000 arrests after the fact. We can't take satisfaction of responding to 911 calls in 7 minutes because the crime's already occurred. The goal is to prevent it in the first place. That's what a doctor tries to do, preventive care. The goal of a doctor is to keep you from coming to his office in the first place. And that should be our goal, but it was not in the 70s and 80s. And this is something that the Manhattan Institute in its research recognized and began to write about. And so there was a symbiotic relationship with Kelling, myself, Manhattan Institute, that began telling, in addition to stories around education and the economy, really embraced the importance of dealing with crime and disorder. So that was the start in the 1990s,
the
Larry.
New York experience. And then, of course, there was the interim. And then in 2002, you decided to take an easier assignment, which is the commissioner of Los Angeles Police Department, which had the worst racial record with the Black community in the country. And that was also under a federal consent decree at the time. The federal government was watching over your shoulder to make sure you did things. And as opposed to just reporting to a mayor, you had to report to a police board of 7. You had 7 bosses, if I know correctly. And you had a city that was much more wide, diverse. How do you get the police out there in the cars? How do you get that quality of life? But you said no problem. And so why don't you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Oh.
Because it really was quite extraordinary.
To understand my going to LA, you have to understand me. I'm a crises manager. I'm a transformational leader. I don't want to go into a department that's being well run or a city that's not in some degree of chaos. I like to fix things. That I'm not a maintenance person. Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, get the right people on the bus, wrong people off the bus, the right people in the right seats. I want the people behind me to want my job because I only intend to stay around for a couple of years to turn the place around, and I intend to get off the bus and let one of them get into the driver's seat. So I never worry about anybody wanting my job. They can have it. I'm only going to be around for a couple of years. And my second role model is Bob DeGrazia. Bob DeGrazia came into the Boston Police Department when I was getting ready to leave it in 1973, turned around that very corrupt, brutal, racist department, as many police departments in America were in that era. But he showed what one man could do who basically had the courage and the skills and the capacity to come in and take on an entrenched bureaucracy. And he was an outsider, an Irish-controlled police department in a very racially divided city, 6'3" Italian, wearing these outrageous-looking 3-piece suits, had an afro, got rid of the commissioner's black Buick 336 and replaced it with a Dodge baby blue car with a blue vinyl roof. And no police driver, basically drove himself around the city. And he turned that place around and created an opportunity for young Billy Bratton at age 27 to become the youngest sergeant in the history of the Boston Police Department. And then 4 years later, the number 2 person in the department behind the commissioner. So he taught me early on that the difference one person can make who has the ability to come in with ideas, a vision, and develop collaboration. So going into LAPD, keep in mind I had left 96 with Giuliani. I thought my police career was over. The epitome of policing is the New York Commissioner's position. I ended up with a good reputation, still lasts to this day, about being one of the architects along Jack Maple, John Timoney, and the incredible group of people I got to work with in the NYPD. No one man does it all. One man can make the difference, or woman, but it does take a team. And one of the things I think I'm very good at is assembling a Super Bowl team. And I've had mayors, even Mayor Giuliani in the first go-round, allowed me to assemble my own team. And I've always had an extraordinary team. LA was a different challenge. I'd been out of the business for 6 years, although I was consulting. The mayor from Paterson just showed me a report I did in my consulting days for Paterson, New Jersey, Trenton, New Jersey, in 2000. That he has a copy of it here. And that's what I was doing for 6 years. It's also part of the federal monitorship of the LAPD, the largest federal consent decree in history. Huge. And I was one of the police monitors for that. When the job opened up in 2002, I jumped for it. I was desperate to get back in the business, particularly after 9/11. On 9/11, I was one of the most forlorn people in America, working in my office in New York City and not being able to do anything about what was going on 2 miles down the road at the lower end of Manhattan. The idea of, here I once was the most powerful person in that city, and now there was no role. So New York, Los Angeles provided the opportunity to come back into the business at a time of great crises. Crime and disorder up until 2001, and now we had terrorism to deal with. And then later on, 2006, 2007, we have all the issues of the internet, cybercrime, digital world to deal with during that period of time. LA is very different than New York. No two cities alike. I dare say, Mr. Mayors, your 3 cities, a lot of people say great similarities, but you understand they're totally different. Yes. They might look the same demographically, they might look the same, but it's like a doctor. No two patients are exactly the same. And the skill is understanding your patient, what needs to be prioritized, what needs to be coordinated. And I think that's a skill, fortunately, I've possessed and developed over 50 years in the business. So going into LA was, I describe it like the old Ginger Rogers, Fred Astaire description, that Ginger Rogers did everything that Fred Astaire did, except she did it backwards in high heels. And effectively, that's what I was trying to do in LA. In New York City, I had 38,000 cops in that city of 8 million people. In LA, I had 9,000 in a city of 4.5 million people. 480 square miles versus the density of New York, 300 square miles. Totally different environment. You could take America's 10 of America's largest cities geographically and fit them into the geographic city of Los Angeles. That's how big the place is. The frequency of seeing a police car, black and white, in Los Angeles was so infrequent that when my wife and I were driving around, when she would see one, she'd describe it as a sighting. That Bill, there's one. That what you were apt to more see was the black and white helicopters in the sky, because they extensively used those helicopters. Why? Helicopter was good for the equivalent of 30 police cars on the ground, just for what they could police. So the challenge in LA was to deal with the worst racial situation in America. The LAPD had for 50 years been terrorizing the black community, resulted in 2 of the worst riots in the nation's history. And it was a very demoralized department. The union had spent $1 million to get rid of the former police chief, who I succeeded, who was a black, who was very popular in the black community, but was not accomplishing what you want out of public safety. Crime was going up. Disorder was increasing dramatically. You think you have a problem with the homeless in the East, go visit Skid Row in Los Angeles. There is nothing in America like Skid Row in Los Angeles, which unfortunately now in the last 2 years has spread throughout the rest of the city. So the challenge there, Larry, was literally to try to replicate what was done in New York, but this time to address the race issue. And I spent so much time, particularly in my African-American communities of Los Angeles, Watts, South LA, that it actually ended up hurting me in 2007 when I had a major police riot involving the Latino community on May Day. And my relationships in the Latino community was not as strong as I developed in the black community. And it really took me a phenomenal effort to deal with that, what I describe as the second most significant crisis in my police career. But the good news was with the black community that when I left in 2009, the LA Times, which was extraordinarily hostile to the Los Angeles Police Department, editorialized that in the editorial about my leaving, finally, a corner has been turned on race relations in Los Angeles. And who brought it about? The LAPD. The irony that the entity most responsible for the terrible race relations was instrumental in bringing it about. And my belief is that in dealing with race issues, ethnic issues, all the issues of the day, and I think you as political leaders can appreciate this, police are the essential catalyst to either do great harm or to do great good. And so the challenge is to do great good. So LA turned out to be quite a success story in its own right. Once again, I got the right people on the bus, and that my two successes have been people that I got on the bus, got in the right seats. Same in New York City. My two successes in New York City were people I recruited onto the bus, got in the right seats, and when I got off, they stepped up. And so I see both of those cities, and then my subsequent time with Mayor de Blasio, a very different mayor, as successes in the sense that the mission was to reduce crime, reduce disorder, improve the city's economies, serve the political leadership. And so I learned my lesson with Giuliani. I had great times with Mayor Hahn, who appointed me. Mayor Hahn's appointment of me as chief cost him the election the next time around because the black community, despite getting along well with me, turned on him because he had, in fact, got rid of the black police chief. And Hahn knew when he appointed me, bringing a white guy from New York, that it might cost him the election. But talk about political courage. He felt that it was desperately needed to get rid of the other chief who was not responsive to him as a mayor. He effectively would not listen to the mayor, would not meet with him. Can you imagine your chief's not meeting with you? But that's what he was up against. And it cost him. He lost that election, but he effectively saved Los Angeles with his sacrifice.
Just one final wrap up. On your third tour in New York with the mayor de Blasio.
A very different mayor.
The controversial and the very controversial, again, a racially charged issue, which was stop and frisk. You know, and it was accelerating in terms of numbers. And I think it would be important for the audience here to kind of hear your view about that and how in policing, while there are principles of policing, you have to kind of adjust them as realities change on the ground. So why don't you do a minute or two on that, and then we'll open it up with the mayors.
In the book, The Profession, I use a lot of medical comparisons and analogies because, let's face it, our goals are the same: to do no harm, in policing to do minimum harm as we are authorized to use force. You authorize a doctor to operate on you, give you radiation, give you chemo. Government authorizes the police to use force when appropriate, and the challenge is to use the minimum so you don't harm the patient, in our case, harm the defendant. In terms of dealing with the issues of 2014 in New York, there'd been the crises in New York and around the country around many of the police tactics that we had used historically and that of essential tactics and tools. And that is the one that was most controversial was stop, question, and frisk. You left out the question portion of it, which is the essential element of why you stop somebody in the first place is to question them. And the only time you frisk them, which is about 10% of the time, is when you can basically demonstrate that there's a reason that you fear that that person may be harmed. And so Commissioner Kelly, who came in with Mayor Bloomberg, along with my successors, Safer, Carrick, the now felon Carrick, and then the subsequent commissioners, all adhered to the understanding of using police, but to use them constitutionally, compassionately, consistently. But Commissioner Kelly faced the issue of losing 6,000 officers after the Great Recession of 2008, put 1,000 additional officers to deal with terrorism. But he still had to deal with crime and disorder, keep it down. So he created a program called Operation Impact, where he took the newest academy kids out of the academy and assigned them to the 25 most difficult crime precincts in the city. One sergeant supervising 12 of them. It's like trying to herd cats. And so these young kids were pushed to be active in the neighborhoods. They were largely in Black and Latino neighborhoods. And if they were making mistakes in doing their stops, who was there to correct them? One sergeant supervising 12 of them. So those mistakes began to be compounded. They were not using appropriate, reasonable suspicion standards. In the black community, which was understanding that crime was going down dramatically, that their neighborhoods were improving, businesses were opening up, McDonald's, hotels, grocery stores, the essentials of any vibrant community, was saying to the commissioner and to Mayor Bloomberg, why are you increasing the number of stops up to 700,000 documented? And you and police and the audience understand 700,000 documented, there are probably twice as many as that. Mm-hmm. Why are you still applying so much chemo, so much radiation to my cancer? Because the cancer's receding. Mm. And Kelly really did believe that these stops were resulting in keeping crime down. They may have been. I did not agree with that. I felt you could get crime down with reduced stops because there was less crime in any event. But it ended up causing extraordinary controversy. A federal judge ruled against the department. And when Mayor de Blasio hired me, part of it was he had come to me for some tutoring, if you will, as he was running for mayor. He was campaigning on the issue, stop, question, and frisk, that he would end it. And I said, you can't end it. It's constitutionally protected. And if you ended it, give up, your city's going to basically shut down. It's an essential tool of policing. What you can do is reduce it dramatically and use it more appropriately. And so right now, New York does about 10 or 12,000 documented stops. I shouldn't use right now as a comparison because right now the place is a mess over there. But up to 2018 and 19, with decreasing stops, crime kept going down, disorder kept going down. Rikers prison population went from 22,000 down to 9,000. State prison population was down by 40%, and that's a violent crime population. People aren't in state prison for fare evasion or for selling dope on a corner. They're there mostly for violent crime, and many of them mentally ill, unfortunately. But the idea was that we were getting it right in New York City. We began to implement, and my successor, Jimmy O'Neill, fully implemented neighborhood policing. We were putting the beat cops back into the neighborhoods. We resected the whole city. Every cop got a smartphone. It was working. And relationships were still strained around the stop, question, frisk issue, the lingering effects of it. But that was the whole idea of neighborhood policing, put cops back in the neighborhood face to face with the community. But before we had time for that to mature, our political leadership in Albany and our leadership in the city council decided they were going to reform what had already been reformed. And they've made a mess of it. And the last 2 years are proof positive of that.
Yeah. So we'll get into that as we have our discussions, which will open up now with the mayors, because I'd like them to have the opportunity to ask you questions on the kinds of things on their mind. So I'll start with our host here, the Honorable Andre Saya. Mayor Saya assumed the office of Mayor of Paterson on July 1st, 2018, focusing his administration on stabilizing property taxes, improving public safety, and driving economic development. He's determined to inspire a renaissance in the third largest city in New Jersey, driven in part through tourism and economic development around the city's greatest resource, the Paterson Great Falls Historical Park. He graduated with highest honors from Seton Hall University with a bachelor's degree in history and a master's from Columbia in public policy. So, Mr. Mayor, how would you like to want to approach Commissioner Bratton, and just in terms of your challenges here in the cities, particularly in law enforcement and your concerns, and any kind of advice you would seek in that respect?
And advice you would give.
Well, Commissioner,
I'm the product of listening to a lot of very smart people over many years.
Well, Commissioner, if you could help us lobby for 6,000 police officers, you'd be doing us a big favor in Paterson.
He's no longer alive, but Dave Dinkins, God love him, right. He doesn't get enough credit. Without those 6,000 cops, we wouldn't have been able to do it. So his legacy is that he, kind of like Johnny Appleseed, he planted the seeds. Mm.
Well, first, I want to express my appreciation to Regina Agia, the Garden State Initiative, Urban Mayors Association, Ashia Hayes, Sheriff Association, Sheriff Gannon, Sheriff Anthony Curitan. Thank you for putting together this forum. And I'm profoundly grateful to you, Commissioner Bratton, for being in Paterson today. I thoroughly enjoyed your book. It only took me about a year to read it. I highly recommend it.
There's some good pictures too, so it's
that's where I went first.
Take a breather from the reading. We look at the pictures.
So you raised a lot of salient points that are relevant today. we're struggling in this pandemic. Mental health is a serious challenge. Something that I was able to glean from your experience in Los Angeles is that you had smart cars that would accompany the police cars with individuals who are trained in mental health assistance. That's something that I'd like to implement here in the city of Paterson. But also with Stop, Question, and Frisk, you gravitated towards precision policing, something we're doing more in Paterson with the Violent Crime Initiative, where you're really targeting your violent offenders. And you mentioned Sir Robert Peel. He said that the police are the public, and the public is the police. Nothing could be more true. And that's why we want to invest more in community policing, because I think the operative word in 21st century policing is trust. There has to be trust between the police and the public, because it can't be effective without it. And we have to emphasize the fact that law enforcement is not the enemy. They're an ally, that they're here to help. They're here to protect and serve. And those are some of the points that I was able to glean from what you wrote in your book. And I think it's very helpful for anyone who's interested in policing, because for the very first time, we've implemented body cameras. So police officers in Paterson are wearing them, and it's helping, not only with just trust, but accountability, but on both sides, with the officer and the individual that the officer is interacting with. So there are no questions as far as transparency is concerned. And I can recall that with Comstat, the late and lamented Jack Maple, your friend, you emphasized that ad nauseum in the book. We went to the Jack Maple room, public safety director, our chief, deputy chiefs. We saw it in action. It was January 9th, 2020. I remember because of my wife's birthday, and she gave me permission to go to NYPD. My brother-in-law's here, Sergeant Gaddafi Balgahom. Thanks for joining us. And we were all ready to go. And then a little over a month later, what happens? COVID-19. Mm-hmm. But prior to that, December 28, 2019, I was visiting James Spamiano from the NYPD, and he told me, Mayor, bail reform. Watch out for that. And that's why I'm proud to be with my fellow and favorite mayors, Ted Green and Reed, because there's a specific aspect of bail reform that we really need to revisit. And that deals with gun possession. Because what's happening, these individuals are not being detained, and they're released, and they're either the shooter or the shooting victim. So I'm hoping that if there's a takeaway from our interaction with you, it'd be that we take a look at bail reform, we revisit it, we tweak it, we amend it, and make sure that these shooters are not back out on the street.
Mm-hmm. Two thoughts along that line. The Salt Lake District Attorney, God love him, recently announced that despite the effort to try to find additional ways to try and keep people out of jail, bail reform, criminal justice reform, that anybody involved in a gun-related crime, he would prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law that the law allowed him, without exception. Something that New York and its prosecutors have abrogated their responsibilities to the public and bending over backwards to protect defendant rights. What goes on in New York courts and district attorneys' offices as it relates to gun crime is a disgrace. There's a story in the paper the other day of a young man, I think either 16 or 17, who's been arrested 3 times on gun charges in the last several weeks. But because of part of the criminal justice reform, raising the age from 16 to 18, where a young person is treated as an adult, that young man keeps going back to family court, where nothing basically is going to happen to him. He gets released to the custody of whatever family he has. So your point, sir, just that, the idea of constantly seeing what everybody else is doing with all of our intentions to try to have a fairer, more just system. But we have to recognize, unfortunately, there are bad people out there that are looking to hurt other people. And so the obligation, the first obligation, has to be to defend the public, and then to try to take care of the rights of the defendants. And I'm glad you spent so much time on the book, obviously, that in terms of what you just recited. But the issue of bail reform, which set in motion a phenomenal catastrophe, I believe, in New York State, you, at least in New Jersey, allow your judges to look at a defendant and make a determination, is this person a threat to public safety separate from the charge for which he is in front of the judge? In New York State, that is the only state that does not allow that in the union. A judge has no power to look at the person's propensity to be a public safety threat, despite all of their efforts at reform. And that's a significant issue. Another one that I'm doing an op-ed on that'll be out the next couple of days that John Miller just did for the Daily News, for the NYPD. The legislature's not done with their reforms in New York. And in New York State, I'm not sure if you have the same thing here, very frequently a criminal's records are sealed from the media, sealed from the public. The idea, give him a fresh chance, him or her a fresh chance. These are police records, arrest records of an individual, sometimes 100 arrests. The legislature is trying to pass legislation that the police would not be allowed to look at a sealed record, which is in their possession. A tremendous tool in basically understanding the criminal that they have just arrested. So the idea that everybody arrested is going to basically, it's as if it's the first time ever when they go before the judge, that nobody can look at the sealed record. That's the insanity of what's going on. It'd be like going to the doctor, and basically the doctor, you sitting there mute in front of the doctor. What ails you? I can't tell you. You're going to have to basically figure it out for yourself. The stupidity of criminal justice reform. And my great frustration, Larry Mone, certainly the great work they did at the Manhattan Institute, and I'm certainly of law enforcement, is that we were getting so much right that in 2018, 365 murders in New York, down from 2,243, and going down, that murders in New York City were down 90%, overall crime down 80%. And so what were they going to reform? Prison population down dramatically, which is one of the goals. And so they were reforming reforms that they didn't even know were in existence. And at the beginning of the book, prologue to the book, I have a quote. Those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And what are we doing in 2021? We're repeating the history of the 70s and the 80s. Yeah. And the second part of that quotation, and I think some of my police colleagues in the room would agree, and this is John Chimney's quote, and those who know police know we don't know our history. And that's one of the issues in policing. We don't teach it. We don't in our police academies teach it, that if you learn it on your own, and I happen to love history, and I'm a student of police history, but I would just bet most of my contemporaries really, oftentimes they might know something about the history of their department, but they don't know the history of policing. And that's why events like this are important, for the idea of coming together, sharing ideas, and particularly an event like this where it's mayors who basically ultimately control the destinies of, in your case, cities. You know, police chiefs influence it, but basically the other guys that control it, the other guys that basically go to the voters and are held accountable for it.
Mayor Cascara, would you like to, from Trenton, would you like to weigh in on this issue in terms of the way you see it in Trenton?
Yeah.
What's going?
And first of all, David Dinkins is a native of Trenton. So
I was not aware of that. He was a good friend, but I was not aware of that. Oh, okay.
One of the things that in the city of Trenton, we've had an uptick in violent crimes as well. In large and small cities across America are experiencing the same thing. And one of the things that when you came in 2000 to evaluate our police department really shook things up. And I think that periodically we need to do that again, to always take a fresh look at policing and how you could better things.
I know just the consulting firm that could do that.
I'll get your card later on.
Deja vu all over again.
Yogi Berra.
Yogi Berra.
One of the things is it's important not to put the police department in a silo, and I have public safety cabinet meetings because invariably other departments can weigh in for health and human services. Mental health counseling is so important, and we're getting money from the American Recovery Funds to set up counselors and also do a street team similar to what Newark is doing, but also addressing the blighted housing. We have 1,000 abandoned houses in Trenton, and a lot of them become stash houses. So we work with the Department of Economic Development and Housing to make sure that these houses are coming down. And so it's important not just to look at it from policing, because we can't arrest our way out of the crime, but we have to do it as a holistic approach and that this is really an interdepartmental job to look at crime holistically and really work together. Our directors, actually, we had 5 directors meet yesterday and to talk about how crime and policing overlap into the other departments.
The issue you raise about the housing, there was a wonderful article in the New York Times Sunday magazine 2 weeks ago, a couple of professors who did a study reinforcing kind of broken windows, in the sense that we tend to think of broken windows from the police aspect of it, the idea of behavior on the streets, graffiti, et cetera. But this study was the idea of, in a blighted neighborhood, the idea of the ability to fix up a house or two on that neighborhood to see what could be done, and how that kind of spread. And it was phenomenal, because from my perspective, something I basically philosophize about broken windows, the importance of it. It can spread to so many other areas, and your issue about interdepartmental cooperation. Police can't do it alone, but they need to coordinate with so many other entities. And in Detroit, the chief of police there, Jimmy Craig, who's now running for governor, worked with me as a captain in the LAPD when I was chief out there. When Jimmy went in, one of the things he immediately started focusing on was streetlights. In Detroit, 50% of the streetlights didn't work. And so the city was incredibly dark. And so he went about just that one effort of basically getting those lights fixed and brightening up a neighborhood, then working on neighborhoods where they'd fix up a house or two. And they were in the process of tearing down 50,000 houses, but they were trying to find people who would be willing to restore the houses. So that point is very, very important, in the sense of, it's, what's the expression? If you build it, they will come. One brick at a time, one house at a time. And it's the world that you guys live in as mayors.
Maybe this would be a good time to bring in Mayor Ted Green of East Orange, because I see here from your background that you are working on a very successful Mayor on the Block cleanup program in your city. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that and how it interacts with some of the issues that we've been covering here.
Yeah, and thank everyone and Mayor for allowing me to be a part of this great discussion today, and to our commissioners. Good seeing you. I have watched you over the years on TV in East Orange. But let me just say this. I want to just point out something that the commissioner said earlier about the importance of the mayor and the chief having a great rapport. And in the city of East Orange, our Chief Bendy, who has been doing a fantastic job, we have a tremendous rapport. As the mayor, which she's a woman, chief, who is heading the police force of 195. And I do want to point out, which as a councilman, we had over 300 and some police officers. Now we dropped down to 190 something, which we're trying to get back to that number. But in that effort, she has been doing an outstanding job with our police force. And that comes from really the communication that you talked about earlier, how we communicate. And in East Orange, when you talk about the mayor on the block, I just want to point out some things. We're a city of 65,000 residents. We are known for a bedroom community. But with a lot of things that has been going on around other cities, not knocking any other cities, East Orange is very unique, because me walking in the office in 2017, 2018, we had a crime reduction of almost 60%. Almost 79% crime reduction. Then the 3.5 years that I have been in office, was able to drop that down to another almost 20%. And that's through the effort of initiatives that our police chief, Chief Bendy, along with the administration, set out to do. We knew straight out of the bat that we had to come in with making sure that public safety was a #1 priority. Period. We know that, because that's what drives any city and what they do. Public safety. People want to feel safe. People want to make sure that when their kids go to school, they're safe. People want to make sure when they get off the trains, if we have a train station in the city of East Orange, that they're safe. And we drive those initiatives around what we call Mayor on the Block. So our goal was coming in, how do we connect with our community? How do we go out door to door, knock on the door with our police department, fire department, DPW, all my whole staff, every director, every manager, twice a week, we are out in different wards of the city, and we knock on doors, and we actually take government to the front doors of the community. So sometimes you don't have to come out.
Great campaign slogan.
Well, yeah. But we're
to the front
driving
door.
that. But the question I do want to ask, and the mayor talked about it, was sometimes that with the hard work of the men and women who drives public safety, the bail reform has been really just a hammer to a nail driving in the wood, right? Because we have witness, you know, and my chief and I, we speak regularly. And she'll call me on a Monday and say, "Man, we went after 2 or 3 guys who were selling drugs or car theft." And then the next Monday, she'll call me and say, "You know, they back on the street, man." And I guess from your experience and the things you have accomplished in New York and LA, what would be your initiative? Because we're working with everybody. Our goal ain't to lock everybody up. That's not our goal. Our goal is also to help in some of the illness that we're having in our community with our adults, with our teenagers, and try to create hubs around that, because people need help, you know, job opportunities. But what was your goal when you had to deal with, when you talked about the prostitution, the drug dealers? What were some of the initiatives when you arrested those individuals? What initiative did y'all have set up to not allow those folks to go back into that revolving door?
It's a great question, because the evolution of policing is shaped oftentimes by revolutions. The crime surge of the 70s and 80s were a revolution, but then community policing, the appreciation of the importance of partnership, the importance of problem solving, focusing on what each neighborhood's priorities are, and the goal of prevention rather than just response. So we embraced policing, government embraced it, the idea of, along the way we made a lot of mistakes. We did lock up too many people. We had to lock up a lot of people. Make no mistake about it. I could not have turned around crime in New York or LA without locking up a lot of people who needed to be locked up and kept locked up for a while. But the mistakes we made, the allegations of mass incarceration, that there's no denying with our Rockefeller drug laws in New York, for example, 3 strikes and you're out in California, that too many people went to jail who would have benefited more, and society would have benefited if they could have gone into some form of really extended treatment program. Not the 2-week or the weekend, but lessons learned. The idea that not everybody has to go to jail. Lessons learned that mandatory sentencing, that allowing for discretion, that not everybody has to go to jail for 10 years for an offense. They could possibly go for a lesser time, but also lessons learned about trying to make the prisons less impactful in a negative way and use that time to focus on education, job training, dealing with the mental health issues they have. One of my great frustrations with what's going on in New York right now around close Rikers Island and then build these high-rise tower jails. I think the sheriffs would agree the last thing you want is a high-rise tower jail, putting everybody in elevators up and down. But here you have this island out there where you could level half of it, and for that $8 billion, build a state-of-the-art facility that can deal with the mentally ill, deal with job training, deal with education, in housing that is not so debilitating that it basically drives people insane while they're in there. So we have learned that there's so many different ways to do it. But essential to it all is still the ability of police to stop crime, and oftentimes that requires the arrest, but then it's the subsequent issues about what do you do with it. And there's a bridge too far, the bail reform in your state, my state, where it's the idea of let them out, but then what are you going to do with them?
Right.
They don't have probation officers any longer. They don't have parole officers. New York State, when they let them out of prison, where do they go? They go into shelters in New York City. The shelters are a nightmare. There's no control on them. And so lessons learned, but we're not applying them. And Mr. Mayor, in your initial comment, you talked about the smart cars in LA. 15 years ago in LA, we had smart cars, a uniformed officer, but a clinician that would respond to the mentally ill calls, instead of the police officers going on their own without somebody that had skills at working with the emotionally disturbed. New York City, however, has 3,000 of those calls a day, 3,000 a day. There is not enough money to basically staff up what some of the advocates are arguing for. They want to defund the police you as mayors understand your police departments aren't particularly well-funded as it is. You're going to take money away from them to try and staff up another bureaucracy. Are they going to be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to deal with the emotionally ill, the narcotics addicted, or the homeless? No. That's the foolishness of defund the police. Instead, the collaboration we're talking about, equip the police with better training, because they are still always going to be the first responders. But develop collaboration tools where there are smart cars, where there are basically collaboration between the homeless outreach, between the those dealing with the narcotics issues. But the idea of we only train these cops for 6 months and then they get totally inadequate in-service training after they graduate, and we expect them to deal with these life or death issues around homelessness, the drug addicted, the mentally impaired, with a safety net. And why are we the safety net? Because basically government has failed to address adequately these issues over the last 50 years. So who are you going to call at 3 o'clock in the morning? Mental service people aren't there. The narcotics people are not there. It's the police that are there. So if you want to basically stop all these videos of police inappropriately dealing with these 3 issues, train them, equip them better, and basically partner them up. So this idea of take the police away, every police chief in this room would tell you they'd love to get away from dealing with those 3 issues because they're the 3 toughest issues they deal with. But they can't. It's not going to happen. So the defund the police movement, which right now there's a Pew poll that was out yesterday showing there's only 15% now supporting the idea of defund the police. And most of them don't even realize what they're defunding. So I was happy that in your reading the book that you picked up on the idea of there were reforms in place. We're constantly learning. And in LA, we learned to deal with the mentally ill. Let's have these smart cars that instead of having 2 cops showing up at the door with a shotgun, show up with a clinician who might be able to basically resolve the situation better.
Yeah. Sir, do you have another question?
Yes, in your book, you underscored the importance of order maintenance. And it's hard to maintain order when you can't maintain a relationship with the people that you protect and serve. And that's why you would emphasize the fact that community policing is where we should really make that investment as opposed to defunding the police.
You need to give them time to interact with the community. If they're busy totally responding and dealing with crises and have no time to really just engage your knock on the door program.
Yeah.
That's what these neighborhood coordinating officer in New York City is all about. It's modeled after the senior lead officer program that I saw when I went to LA. It is volunteer officers who basically are free from calls, who effectively spend their whole time knocking on doors, walking, going into stores, getting to know people, giving them their smartphone numbers, their email, so they can interact with them. That's what drives me crazy about the legislature in New York and the council and the state. They have no understanding of all the things that are going on in the police department to address the issues they're trying to reform. It's so frustrating. I'll tell you. It's I've spent 50 years of my life trying to get this right, and I think we finally we're getting it right in LA and New York. And then we have a generation of political leadership that most of them weren't even alive. The average age going into the New York City Council this January, I think is something like 32 or 34. They weren't around in 1990 when those 243 murders were occurring.
Yeah.
And if I may dovetail on that,
Sure.
You also have underscored cultural competence and cultural immersion. I found that to be effective in the city of Patterson. I saw our councilwoman, Dr. Lisa Mims. We attended an event recently with community policing. It was a skateboarding event in Patterson. And I was so encouraged because it was such a positive event that our city needed.
Did you break
now.
Anything?
Did I break anything?
Did you break anything?
Yeah, actually, I hurt my toe. Did you know that? Okay.
You wouldn't get me up on a skateboard, I'll tell you that. I'm happy to be an observer.
But I feel like that's what you are focused on. Community immersion, cultural competence, knowing the people that you protect and serve. It's really essential to being effective as far as
I'd be
policing
willing
is
to
concerned.
bet here in New Jersey, and because you mirror across the river in New York, in terms of the population makeup, that probably some of the more progressive entities in immersion, if you will, assimilation, have been the police. The idea of minorities joining the department, and I look at NYPD as a minority majority police department, 20 some odd % female. the rest of the population, 15, 18% African American, reflecting the overall population of the city, 1,000 Muslim officers, reflecting that huge population of 1 million Muslims in the city. That the idea of policing, particularly in larger cities, and I'd dare say probably in your cities, is increasingly reflective of the populations they're serving. So that there's a greater appreciation of the rank and file officers, and an officer's riding beside a black, or riding beside a Sikh, or riding beside a Muslim officer as they engage with each other. There's that cultural immersion that occurs just because of that proximity. And that's not widely recognized, just how progressive policing has been in its acceptance of gays, trans, that
It's been a big change.
probably more so than society as a whole.
It's not a change that's been reported on.
Not at all, but it's the reality.
And I'm glad that we did embark on that, man. Thank you about community policing. And one thing, how we have been very successful in East Orange is that 95% of our police force reflects the community. But not only that, many of them are born and raised in the city of East Orange. And what our chief did is she not only have our public relations go out in the community, but they are in the parks. They are engaging with our young people. They go to the basketball games. She comes out, I come out. Probably a majority of our police force know our young people by first name basis, and they know some of the officers. We still having a few issues with a few kids, with some of the gang members, but we are starting to set up incubators around the city to include them in the things that we're doing in the city. And I guess, Commissioner, my question to you would, how did you, as you curb the crime with gang members and the gang activities, how did you filter some of them who said, you know what, I want to fly right and do the right thing? How did you get those individuals to also help out in the community? Because we are embracing those folks also, because sometimes they can't help.
Let me give you two thoughts that are in the book. That I'm obviously white, grew up in a working class white neighborhood. First blacks I encountered basically wasn't until I got into high school. Boston was an incredibly segregated city. But despite my background, my life, as a white police chief, police commissioner, I have always championed this issue of dealing with the issue of race. And so going into Los Angeles, for example, that incredibly racially divided city, I think I was particularly effective as a chief of police, even though I was a white police chief, in the black communities, for the fact I immersed myself into those communities to hear and listen to them. And it was reflected, and I recount this in the book, that one of the community activists that I engaged with was a woman named Sweet Alice, born in the Deep South with all the issues of the Deep South of the 50s, and like so many left to go to California to a better environment, and created in Watts, in the housing developments down there, the most crime-ridden area, most racially segregated part of that city, most violent, a community center that dealt with young children. She has a center that she gets parolees coming out of prison that come into her environment for the first 3 months. Mm-hmm. She gets them jobs, et cetera. And I spent myself and my wife, Ricky, spent a lot of time with her. And Tolliver's Barbershop, that, black community, basically, you want to put your finger on the pulse, you go to the barbershop. And I actually got the barbershop award from the black barbers in Los Angeles. So in terms of, I try to understand the issues, and that's when I talk about excuse me, officers working in a ethnically and racially mixed department, they learn from each other about the respective cultures. When I left LA in 2009, and I recount this story in the book, we go down to say goodbye to Sweet Alice, and she gives us the big hug, and she always had my back. That was her claim to fame. Chief, I'll always have your back. And as we're leaving, she gives me a big hug, and she says, with this delightful Southern drawl, you know why we like you so much, Chief? And I said, oh, Sweet Alice, why is that? You see us. You really see us. That's the highest accolade I've ever received in my life, and all the awards and things that I've gotten over the years. That from that woman, she got me, that I really made an effort to not just see the facade, but to get behind it and really see the people, the community. And that's what I try to encourage with my training of my officers in the neighborhood policing program, that while it's desired that we have these multiracial police forces, the reality is that you call the police, you never know if you're going to get a white guy, you're going to get a black guy, you're going to get a female, you're going to get a gay. What you want is a police officer coming through the door who sees them and cares for them and is going to treat them lawfully, compassionately, consistently.
Correct.
And so that's the key to community policing, and the idea of, fortunately, we recruit a lot of young people who have that as their ideal coming in.
Mayor Gascar, do you have a final question?
Yeah, and actually, two questions. De-escalation and sensitivity training. You mentioned the stats about how many encounters that police have with the mentally ill, and after a while, you see these officers get frustrated and lose their patience, and they sometimes step over bounds to control the situation. What's the importance and extent of de-escalation and sensitivity training? And then the second question is, could you sketch out a Citizens Police Academy for us?
The idea of de-escalation, I'm the beneficiary very early in my career. Young sergeant just promoted. NYPD had developed a hostage negotiation program after a very tragic hostage situation in the early 1970s. Harvey Schlossberg created it. Bob DeGrazia, my hero, brings it to Boston. I'm one of 24 Boston police officers who volunteer for it, go through the psychological screening, 3-week intensive training on hostage negotiations. And what is hostage negotiation? It is the ultimate de-escalation training. The idea of trying to talk somebody down. And I still remember in the academy that going through the training, you're down at the end of the hall and the hostage taker's at the other end of the hall and you're negotiating. And Harry Fontaine, a young sergeant like myself, he's a negotiator. And the hostage taker would not talk with him. And Harry's increasingly getting frustrated, aggravated, and finally breaks short term. And basically, he cracked. He goes running down the hall, "You son of a bitch, I'm gonna kill you." And this is one cop going after another cop in this training session. But just showing the idea of you need to say he flunked out of the program. 1 month after I came out of the training program, I had my hostage situation where I was confronting a bank robber that he's pointing his gun at me, holding a hostage in front of him. I'm pointing my gun at him. I can't do anything with my gun. He's got the hostage in front of him. So this is where the training kicked in. Training, always be training. The muscle memory, the repetitiveness. And recognizing I couldn't basically shoot him. Plus he was surrounded by a mob of 100 some odd people that wanted to kill him. That I lowered my gun. And that was the de-escalation. And look, you haven't really hurt anybody here yet. Let's talk this through. And we did it. And so that's the other critical negative about defund the police. You want to refund the police to constantly train them. We shouldn't train them for 6 months. We should train them for a year and a half, and then constantly train them. One of the great benefits of Mayor de Blasio, despite some of the craziness that he's been engaged in the last couple of years, during my 3 years with him, that's the first time in my 50-year law enforcement career I had money to do everything. I had money to buy technology, smartphones for every cop, bulletproof windows in every police vehicle, tactical gear in the trunk of every car, so when they responded, the bulletproof vest they wear will not stop an AK-47 round, but the tactical vest and the Kevlar helmet will. We spent a fortune on equipping the officers, but we also put every New York City police officer through a week of de-escalation training. We put them through a week of narcotics identification training, understanding narcotics, under the influence of narcotics, they respond differently. We put them through implicit bias training. We put them through a lot of training in the course of a year because we could afford the overtime to replace them in the field. You as politicians know you want cops out on those streets. You don't want them necessarily sitting in the classroom where nobody sees them. But in many respects, they're better off in the classroom, because then when they get back onto the streets, they're going to have the skills necessary so they don't end up in the evening news inappropriately applying a use of force, where if they had constant training constant training, that would not happen. So
Okay.
that's the pushback on defund the police. What's the expression? You get what you pay for. You don't want to pay for training. You want to go to a doctor that after he gets out of medical school, never keeps up with his profession.
I know they want to get the question out, but just one more. In terms of you fighting crime on the ground, what technology did you use also to help you fight that crime? Because we
started with the basic technology of a map on the wall, plastic acetate, putting little stickum dots to start identifying patterns and trends. That was the beginning of predictive policing, precision policing, hotspot policing, problem-solving policing. As basic as that was. But now we have the beauty of algorithms, we have the beauty of computers, we have artificial intelligence. But the irony, the lack of trust that we talk about of the community, political leadership in police appropriate use of technology. In New York City, City Council doesn't want the police to use drones, afraid they're going to be spied on. The department recently acquired a robotic dog.
That's 5 minutes.
What they now can do with robots is incredible. It's like that old movie a few years back of the robotic cop. And that dog was intended to not have to send a police officer into a situation. City Council made them get rid of the dog because of the technology. They were afraid it was going to be used inappropriately. Facial recognition. Because of the issues of facial recognition. Facial recognition is intended to develop a lead for the police that this person may be the suspect you're looking for, but now you have to take the investigation and make the case. You can't arrest the person just based on the facial recognition. Many cities are banning police use of facial recognition. Crazy. It's like banning the use of fingerprints. So it's ironic, the technology that is there, that I was able to buy literally everything when I was police commissioner, government does not want to allow police to have it. But they need to take a look at all technology. The essential element of it is the rules, regulations, and oversight of its use. Tasers. I see is it your state that's buying, or maybe it's Newark, is going to spend millions of dollars buying tasers finally. A lot of towns didn't want to use tasers, but you want the officer to use his gun or his club instead of the taser. But that's that mistrust of tasers. But the secret is training and supervision and policies on its use. So as you as mayor start making choices about how you equip your officers, it's about policies and procedure control. And the body cameras. Body cameras I've supported from the old days when they're dashboard cameras. Because here in New Jersey, where the first case was made with the state police, the abuse of minorities in the Jersey Turnpike, what did you find after you put cameras in those state police cruisers, which the state police fought hammer and tong? The vast majority of stops were proven to be correct stops based on the cameras. And lo and behold, citizens lie about their encounters with the police. What they say the police said to them or did to them, go to the cameras.
Yeah, we had them since 2015.
So the vast majority of camera incidents work in the favor of police rather than against them. Ironically.
Thanks very much. You did a great job at the beginning describing the policy work we're working on in terms of bail reform. Anything you want to add before we close up here?
Yeah, just to reiterate, with bail reform, we're not criticizing the entire law. What we're saying is that there's a component we feel needs to be amended. So just to borrow a phrase from President Clinton in the 90s, relative to welfare reform, where he said, we're not going to end it, we just want to amend it. We want to amend this law.
Well, that's the effort in New York City, that bail reform was necessary, is needed. When somebody dies in prison after sitting there for 2 years because you can't get out on bail in Rikers, you need reform. But thoughtful, collaborative reform, or in this case, your legislature needs to be talking to you, the mayors, to get your input from on this issue. I wish they had done that in New York. So now we want them to reform the reforms, and they're reluctant to admit their mistakes.
Yeah. So if we could just focus on the component that deals with gun possession, and not allowing these shooters to get back on the streets to either shoot or get shot. We're going to engage our respective legislative delegations. We've already spoken to Assemblyman Benji Wimberly. We're going to be speaking to the entire leadership team here in the 35th District, and I'm sure Mayor Green, Mayor Story will do the same. And then we'll come to a consensus, and I'm hoping that we can have some type of action in the lame duck session.
Terrific. Yes.
Yes, fingers crossed.
Great. Well,
Fingers crossed. My daughter did that this morning. She's 5 years old.
To take off on Winston Churchill.
true.
Ah,
Well, Commissioner Bratton, thank you so much for all of your insights
Thank
and sharing with us.
This was enjoyable. Thank you.